this exercise.
All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Some people might trickle in as we go, but want to leave enough time for Dr. Torre to share and for us to interact. Thank you for being here for this Center for Process Studies seminar on the topic, Quantum Mechanics Predicts Evolutionary Biology. I won't go into detail about our esteemed speaker today, but he's a professor at UCLA, had previously taught at Harvard and University of Maryland, author of a ton of stuff, over 180 peer-reviewed articles, number of book chapters, and 3 books on cellular and molecular evolutionary biology. I guess without any additional ado, John Forday.
Well, it's a pleasure to come here to this venue. And thank you, Andrew, for the opportunity to speak. So I spent 50 years chasing my tail as a developmental physiologist, and with extreme frustration, but it put food on the table for my family, so I kept on doing it. And about 10 years ago, I'll show you the figure, had the opportunity to sort of stand back and realize what I actually had come upon, and the realization that this had to be more than just chance. The evolution, in this case, so I'm a pulmonary physiologist by training, actually a field physiologist, something like that. Anyway, I have a lot of handles. Anyway, I'd like to move on, and so I'm going to ask you to suspend your belief system as if you were in 15th century Europe and they had just discovered that the world was not flat, which, when I try to think of that, that was a remarkable event, as we all know, and it gave rise to the Age of Reason and Enlightenment. We're at an inflection point. Well, optimistically, at an inflection point in human history, we may actually be at a watershed. And so I'd like to think that maybe what I'm talking about might be helpful on the larger stage of consideration of who we are, why we are, and perhaps thinking more about the impact of artificial intelligence and CRISPR, the genetic modification of human beings, which is a very dangerous idea. So everything I'm about to tell you is based on published experimental evidence, my own and that of many, many others in developmental biology, cell biology, and molecular biology. So I'm still a scientist. I'm not a metaphysician. So everything that I talk about, I insist must be hypothetically testable and refutable. Popperian science. So science is the only way we know of knowing what we don't know. And biology remains descriptive, non-predictive, unlike physics and chemistry, which are based on atomic theory. However, there is no central theory of biology, no set of first principles. Until recently, I published a paper back in 2015, the title of which is A Central Theory of Biology, and it actually is predicated on the evolution of being warm-blooded. It's never been explained before. It's always been by association and correlation, not by actual experimental data that show how a fish evolved into an amphibian, reptile, mammal, bird. So that's what I do, and that's what I'm talking about. So this lecture relates to how I came upon what I refer to as the first principles of physiology, which I had never thought about until I sort of backed into this, fell into this rabbit hole, actually. Leading in a forward direction for evolution of vertebrate physiology instead of reasoning after the fact, thinking backwards, which we know is illogical, but we think that's all we've got. I maintain we have the opportunity to think in a forward direction from the unicellular to the multicellular, and that in fact, taking that concept to its extreme to work even further backwards to the singularity and the Big Bang, which gave rise to both physics and biology, as I will claim. And again, it's not metaphysics, it's based upon sound, hopefully sound reasoning. I hope you think that way. So by analogy with the origin of the universe from the singularity as a point source, we have speculated, I've speculated that there is, I'm sorry, there's a co-authored paper, speculated that there is also a point source for biology. That's the cell, and I published a paper showing this, contrasting and comparing physics and biology in this paper, which is cited at the bottom. So here's a depiction of the Big Bang, which was thought to have been preceded by a singularity, and that occurred about roughly 13.8 billion years ago. And in the process, that Big Bang gave rise to both physics and also to biology, based upon this theory, which I think is the general thought as to how everything we witness around us began. So about 4.5 billion years ago, before the Earth had an oxidative atmosphere, or any atmosphere for that matter, comets pelted the Earth. And these comets were composed of water and lipids. There's evidence for that. And the water formed the oceans on the Earth. The lipids became important because they were the genesis, if you will, of life. At least that's my way of thinking about it. And there are a number of people who've shown in various ways that that is in fact the case. I've taken it a bit further than the usual way of thinking about the lipid basis of life. So lipids in water will form what are called micelles or protocells. So here's a schematic in which what happens is that the lipids form these so-called micelles. So they create a membrane enveloping a space. And essentially that's the origin of the most primitive of cells. But what I actually wanted to talk about, and I've been writing about of late, is that all of what I'm talking about actually gave rise, came out of the cosmology of the singularity and Big Bang, giving rise to the cosmos, also giving rise to unicellular organisms, and that ultimately that process gave rise to consciousness as the ultimate selection pressure for biologic evolution. And that, but I will tell you beforehand, that consciousness actually came out of the singularity as the origin of consciousness. So in other words, all of physiology, the aggregate of all of physiology actually is what we think of as consciousness. And I'll try to demonstrate that as I go along. So the continuum from the unicell to the singularity Big Bang starts biologically with the cytoskeleton of the cell. So the cell has this system of tubules which form the infrastructure of the cell. Furthermore, the cellular communication between cells generates homeostasis and allostasis, so the ability of the cell to maintain energetic balance. That concept comes from our knowledge of contemporary embryology, in which we discovered about 50 years ago that, as serendipitously as always, and counterintuitively, that in fact cells do in fact talk to one another, if you will, and the way in which they do that is through soluble growth factors. So we stumbled onto that about in the mid-70s in trying to understand how a simple hormone like cortisol accelerated lung maturation and gave rise to the discipline of neonatology, the treatment of newborns who were born prematurely, and more often than not were dying of pulmonary insufficiency because they could not make lung surfactant. So beyond that, Nicholas Christakis at Yale has shown what he refers to as this communal networking that humans exhibit, and he's been able to demonstrate that through computer algorithms. And he refers to that as the contagion theory. So he's an infectious disease physician, and so he uses contagion as his algorithm for understanding why it is that humans behave in this networking fashion, but suffice it to say that we do. And then you have Lee Smolens, the astrophysicist at the Perimeter Institute in Toronto, who has actually used Darwinian evolution theory to explain black holes and stellar evolution. I heard Smolens speak about 20 years ago, and this astrophysicist friend of mine says, oh yeah, he's using Darwinian evolution as a way to explain cosmology. And I'm like, well, the biologists haven't even figured out how to use Darwinian evolution to understand biology. So that seems peculiar. But be that as it may, Smollen's book, Emergence, about emergence is all about that. So, yeah, so he and I find common ground, me coming from biology, he coming from astrophysics, and so you have the sense that there is this critical mass of thinking and data that might actually yield some interesting concepts, or a interesting concept about how everything may have emerged from this singularity that we speak of. So both the inanimate and animate have their origins in the singularity, and then the Big Bang, if you will, as a consequence of that. So how did I come to this concept? I didn't do it deliberately. This was not a thought, a reasoned process. I basically, so I'm trying to explain, so the lung is depicted here, and it's composed of the tubules that, the bronchi and trachea bronchi, and then bronchioles, and they terminate in these great wide clusters that are the alveoli where the gas exchange occurs. So I spent most of my life studying that phenomenon because, as I said, that's what the Kennedy baby died in 1962. At that time, we didn't know the cause of what he died of, what was referred to as hyoid membrane disease. My mentor, Mary Lavery, discovered that it actually was a deficiency disease. It wasn't, as thought at that time, an obstructive disease. The infant in utero was swallowing amniotic fluid that had fibers in it. That was 50 years of thinking in the obverse direction. Anyway, so the production of the surfactant was realized to be the limiting factor in the transition from intrauterine life to the delivery room and survival at the time of birth. So that was a huge breakthrough, the recognition of the necessity for this soapy material that's produced in the alveoli of newborns and you and I as well. So, for example, drowning victims, the water in their lungs washes the surfactant out, and that's why they'll succumb, because they don't have enough lung surfactant. Now we can replace it, and they survive, even when they're in extremis. So here's a diagram of an alveolus, so these air spaces, which are about 10 microns, 20 microns in diameter, they're not visible to the naked eye, but to the microscope you can see them. They're surrounded by these connective tissue and epithelial cells, and those epithelial cells, this pointer is not working on this board. So these epithelial cells are what produce the surfactant. And so the big breakthrough was Mott Ligon studying the regulation, the mechanism of birth, if you will, treating pregnant ewes in New Zealand with the hormone cortisol, a very simple molecule. And he expected to induce labor, but for the newborn lamb not to survive. Lo and behold, the animal did survive and did fine. So this was a big breakthrough because you had premature lambs who were surviving when they weren't expected to by being exposed to a very simple molecule. And it turned out that the cortisol stimulated the lung surfactant that I just described and prevented respiratory distress syndrome. So this was the, so why does the hormone have this effect on the respiratory system? It was certainly not predicted and a remarkable observation. So it's counterintuitive and illogical, just like everything else in biology, because biology, as I said, remains descriptive, and we perpetuate the Linnaean, sort of parts and Lego blocks kind of attitude towards biology, when in fact there are underlying principles that we can understand that mediate development, phylogeny, and ultimately evolutionary biology, as I will explain. So the effect of the hormone is referred to as paracrine, which was another breakthrough, which we discovered, and that is that it was expected that the hormone would affect the cell type. I'll just back up here. It was assumed that the hormone would affect this cell type because it makes the surfactant, when in fact what we discovered using cell culture work was that it affected the connective tissue cells, these fibroblasts, that actually speak, if you will, through growth factors to the epithelium to induce surfactant. So that was an important breakthrough in understanding not only the development of the lung and the effect of the hormone, but embryology in general, because up until that point it was not understood how embryogenesis, how the formation of structure and function occurred. So is there another logic to the way that we think about biology than the conventional descriptive way we think of it? So here's the schematic that I was on the cover of Pediatric Research in 1995. And what it shows, again, so this is the alveolus as seen by a cell molecular biologist like myself. And here's the vasculature, the microvasculature on the left, and the alveolus space on the right, where gas exchange occurs. So what I discovered over a 50-year haul and a lot of NIH money was that there's an active process by which these red spheres, which are the lipids that constitute the surfactant, are recruited from the circulation. And then they're transferred to the epithelial cells, which are the square blue squares, where the surfactant is made. And all of these steps are mediated by hormones, by mechanical effects, and by growth factors that are shown here, and I won't go into detail, but none of this had been known 50 years ago, and it took 50 years to unveil all of these steps. So that's how the surfactant is made and secreted into the airway, into the alveolus, and how we are able to, so what would happen if you didn't produce surfactant is when you exhale, the lung would actually collapse, the alveoli would collapse on themselves. It's called atelectasis, and you die. The surfactant maintains the surface tension within the alveolar space so that that doesn't happen. And there's interesting physical chemistry that underlies that, related to that micelle that I showed you earlier, but I won't go into the details of that. I'll spare you that. But the point I wanted to make was that when I sat back and I looked at this, and I thought to myself, well, either this all transpired as a function of what's called neutral theory. Give it enough time, good stuff happens. Alternatively, I thought to myself, well, I know that this cell type took about 3 billion years to evolve, and I know that that cell type took about 3 billion years to evolve. So when I did the math, I came to the realization that it would have taken about roughly 10 to the 18th or 19th power years in order for this to transpire, which was longer than the age of the universe, so that made no sense. So the conclusion was that there must be underlying mechanisms that have facilitated this process, culminating in mammalian lungs, like ours, and that of the birds, but the intermediate phylogenetic steps in reptiles, amphibians, and fish. I mentioned fish because so in fish you have a swim bladder, which allows for the fish to maintain buoyancy in water. That's actually the homologue of the lung. We know that now. It's not the gill, it's the swim bladder. And the swim bladder has the same properties, but in the swim bladder, the surfactant is made in the swim bladder, but it just keeps the walls of the swim bladder from sticking to one another. Anyway, so I was able to do this whole process in reverse, both developmentally and phylogenetically, such that I could go all the way back to the origins of the gas exchange process in understanding how cholesterol, which is the most primitive surfactant, actually was able to facilitate gas exchange in unicellular organisms, which dominated the Earth for the first 3.5 billion years of the Earth's existence. It's only the last 500 million years that that complex organisms have evolved. So I came up with this schematic in which on the left, so on the right I'm showing what I've been talking about. That is this interaction between these connective tissue cells and the epithelial cells to make the surfactant. That's full-blown physiology. On the left, I'm contrasting the phylogeny of the lung with the ontogeny, that is the development of the lung. And what you see is that they parallel one another. So Haeckel, who formulated his biogenetic law, actually was right. He just didn't have the knowledge in order to substantiate ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. And that's what I'm showing here. So, and the reason that I'm pretty, I feel correct in saying this is because there are experiments both of nature and experimental data that show that you can actually reverse this process either in chronic disease, because that's, so the chronic diseases of the lung, like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and interstitial pulmonary fibrosis, are simplifying mechanisms. So what happens is the alveoli, which form this, these huge surface. The surface area of our lungs is about the size of a doubles tennis court. It's huge. But in the simplification process, the septation of the alveoli, which is how they formed in the first place, to go from very large structures to much smaller ones to facilitate gas exchange, those walls break down. So there's simplification in the lung, chronic lung disease, there's simplification in the kidney, on and on and on. So all these physiologic chronic diseases are actually demonstrating the evolution of these complex physiologic structures. But it hasn't been appreciated that way because we haven't been looking at it from a cellular, molecular, crosstalk kind of perspective. And as I said, and so experimentally, people have deleted specific genes, like in Jeff Witzett's lab in Cincinnati, they deleted the ability of that epithelial, these epithelial lung cells that make the surfactant to synthesize cholesterol. And when they did that, what happened was that the cholesterol, which is an important basic surfactant, was deficient in these mice that they deleted the cholesterol synthetic mechanism from. And what happened was you had proliferation of those cells to compensate, which was not expected. They just assumed these animals would die. But in fact, you have recapitulation of evolution. And so they cited the work we've done, and so that was an important understanding, breakthrough in understanding how this all transpires, if you will. So the way I gained a lot of insight into all of this was in focusing on the transition from water to land. So Romer, the University of Chicago professor of anthropology, basically had hypothesized that the rise in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere about 500 million years ago caused a greenhouse effect, and that caused drying of the oceans and the rivers and whatever, forcing certain species out of water onto land. That's a well-accepted phenomenon. But what was interesting to me was that there are known to be specific gene duplications that occurred in that transition from water to land. That's well documented. And one of them is the gene for parathyroid hormone-related protein, which I was funded for 30 years to study that gene by the NIH. And I knew that the deficiency in PTH, or the duplication of PTHRP, which is an amplification mechanism, would have fostered more alveoli in the lung, for example. And there are two other genes which are critical for adaptation to land in vertebrates, the glucocorticoid receptor and the adrenergic receptor. And all three of those genes have been shown clearly to facilitate both development, embryonic development, and also phylogeny and adaptation to land. So that all made sense, but nobody ever had the audacity, if you will, to claim that this was a causal kind of relationship, largely because Darwinian evolution is based upon generally on random genetic mutations. So if it's random, how could you associate or even suggest that there's causality here? It makes no sense. And I've been called an idiot, and I don't understand science, on and on and on by the editors of the premier evolutionary biology journals, because they don't understand what I'm talking about. Because I'm talking about a systematic approach to understanding what I consider to be the actual underlying evolutionary principle. Yeah, so I always get ahead of myself. Apologies. And what I'm showing here is the transition from, so this is my version of a swim bladder. So the swim bladder evolving into the primitive lung of frogs. Frogs don't have a diaphragm. They have a muscular structure that exchanges gases, yes, but doesn't have alveoli. It has these huge structures referred to as alveoli. So it's just a very primitive adaptation of the swim bladder to what begins to look like the lung. So the general idea is, as I published in a paper back at the turn of the millennium, is that so if you think about it, so in contrast, I'm regressing the water to land transition against phyla, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And what you see is if you look at structures of the physiology of the kidney, the adrenal, the vagal nerve, the lung, bone, heart, skin, and brain, they all regress and they approach the origin of this Cartesian coordinate. And the reason that they do, first of all, I'm showing the duplication of these three receptors, which I just described, facilitating this process. But ultimately, all of this family of lines that describe the evolution of these physiologic structures and functions originate in that singularity. That's what I'm trying to explain here. That's where that all comes from. So the homologies between quantum mechanics and evolutionary biology is what the title of this talk is. And I published this paper, and I with some trepidation, but what I'm suggesting is that quantum mechanics, as the behavior of matter and energy at the atomic and subatomic levels, has homologies with biology. So first of all, the Pauli Exclusion Principle, which is the underlying principle of the periodic table that explains how electron spin is determined, has homology to what I call the first principles of physiology. So in both cases, the Pauli Exclusion Principle is both deterministic and probabilistic, in the sense that of the four determinants of spin state of the electron, the first three are deterministic, and the fourth is actually probabilistic. It's based upon time. And the same is true of the first principle of physiology. So the formation of the cell, the negative free energy or negentropy within the cell, and the chemiosmotic principle that was described back in 1961 by Mitchell provides the bioenergetics in order to maintain a negative free energy state within the cell. That is the key to understanding what life actually constitutes. The third component, homeostasis, is actually probabilistic. It offers a range of set points for the physiologic entities so that it's not only one size fits all. It's a range of adaptive homeostatic states. And so you have both a deterministic and a probabilistic aspect to biology, as you do in physics. And the uncertainty principle, it comes from the idea that when you form that limiting membrane in that protocell that I described from the micelles, that actually delineated an internal and an external environment, and that is an ambiguity. So we published that paper about 2 years ago, suggesting that there was this something akin to Heisenberg uncertainty principle in biology. And furthermore, that non-localization, this spooky action at a distance kind of thing, which is described in quantum mechanics, is actually the same thing as what happens with pleiotropy. So, for example, you have a crystalline gene in the lens of your eye. You also have a crystalline gene in your liver. How does that work? Well, it's a whole family of these genes which over time have been dedicated to different purposes as the organism has been confronted with novel conditions. And I've suggested that when you have stimulation of the physiology of the organism, those pleiotropic mechanisms actually create electrochemical fields. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but field theory actually emanates from this idea. So actually through coherence and through pleiotropy. So there are homologs, homolog meaning they come from the same origins. So both the physics, the quantum mechanics, and the biology came from the same origin in the singularity of the Big Bang and have their remnant relationships that are still exist, but you can't see them. You know, many people far smarter than me have tried to apply quantum mechanics directly to biology and crashed and burned. So Prigogine, Polanyi, others have said biology is just too complicated to understand as quantum mechanics because that's not the way, in my opinion, that you have to see it. You have to see it from its origins, which referred to as a diachronic approach. So synchronic approach is like Lego blocks. You know, your head bone's connected to the tailbone, and everything sort of gets hooked together. That's seeing everything in the same time frame, whereas diachrony is seeing the process across space and time. And in so doing, as I've just published, you eliminate the time variable. So time is actually an artifact when you actually understand the mechanisms of biology from their origins. And these homologies between quantum mechanics and physiology may underpin what's called panpsychism. So the idea that consciousness is pervasive. That's usually been the realm of philosophers and metaphysicians. I think that it's correct, and I'm trying to suggest that consciousness actually is the nidus, the origin of both physics and biology. We just haven't looked at it in the correct way. And so, for example, Helix Jackson, as you know, the neurobiologist, the English neurobiologist, had proffered that you know, the degradative process in neurodegenerative diseases of the brain actually represented a reverse evolutionary process. I think he was right. He just didn't have all the data in order to demonstrate that, but I think that they exist. So, yeah, so I published this paper in January this year on quantum mechanics and evolutionary biology. The point being, I passed peer review somehow, and so, you know, that somehow constitutes, you know, in the granting process, if you allude to the fact that you've had peer review of some idea, reviewers usually don't go after you with their hammers and, you know, with their knives, but not always. At any rate, so both physics and biology are referred to as self-referential and self-organizing. Well, why is that? I mean, it's sort of glibly stated in the literature, but it's become problematic for people who, like myself and my co-author, Bill Miller, who wrote a book about the evolution of the microbiome. And we discussed this ad nauseum, you know, where does this come from? And fortunately, there's scientific evidence for that now, showing in 2 laboratories in 2017 that the yttrium atom actually aligns itself, at least for 8 atoms and maybe more, in a way where the yttrium atom seems to recognize itself and other yttrium atoms. Well, that was important. But beyond that, it occurred to me not that long ago that, so there was this big bang, but there's also Newton's third law of motion, so there must have been recoil. And that recoil, the equal and opposite reaction, which I'll allude to in a couple of other slides, that is the origin, in my opinion, of self-reference and self-organization, because it's like a microcosm of the singularity. Because that's all that the existence had at the time as a reference point. So that's a bit hand-wavy, I know, and I don't know how to prove that, but maybe, you know, maybe smaller, at least smaller. Anyway, so this is the, me talking about, so we start with, again, with the singularity and the Big Bang, and then we introduce Newton's third law, which causes this recoil or back pressure. And there's one paper showing that balanced chemical reactions may have come out of this property. I maintain that that's what biology is all about. It is biology is the response to that equal and opposite reaction. So, and this, the Big Bang and Newton's third law create the integration of physical and biologic entities. So the emergence versus cell-cell interaction mechanism. So emergence is so the idea that things are complicated and new stuff comes out of this chaos that underlies you know, biology, for example, or physics for that matter. We refer to as emergence. That's not testable, whereas the cell-cell interactions are experimental and testable and refutable. And self-reference and self-organization are based on the first principles of physiology, negentropy, or negative free energy, chemiosmosis, and homeostasis actually do provide the way in which to test that hypothesis, that in fact it's through the networking of the cells and their formulation of homeostasis or lack thereof that we can understand what emergent properties actually constitute. So the hypothesis I'm talking about is, so if the physical and biological realms were both products of the singularity, consciousness as the aggregate of physics and biology is the awareness of all existence. So in contrast to that way of thinking, there's the anthropic principle. Carter, in a lecture in 1975, proffered that, wondered why it is that the Earth is so amenable to life, our lives and that of all the organisms, and the fact that if there was, you know, there's some subtle change in the physics of the environment, that none of what we witness would have occurred. The problem with this idea of the anthropic principle is that it assumes that we got plopped here somehow, as opposed to the fact that we actually are the product of the physical environment. So basically what occurred was that, as I mentioned earlier, so cholesterol in the cell membrane are the most primitive eukaryotes, organisms with a limiting membrane around the nucleus, like us, and yeast. The cholesterol actually made the cell membrane able to practice what's called, what Lynn Margulis, one of my mentors as an undergraduate at Boston University, referred to as endosymbiosis. So the ability of the organism to actually internalize things that would have killed us off eons ago. And now they're made useful because they're compartmentalized by the intracellular cell membranes of the cell. So, for example, iron as an oxidative agent, would have killed us. The heavy metals in general, the gases, oxygen, nitrogen, the ions, they are all internalized and made and become our physiology. That's what's transpired. And so I find great, I take great umbrage at the idea that the Anthrople Principle is the prevailing mechanism by which we exist in this place. We are actually what Sagan said, we are star stuff, literally. Okay. So this premise, based on the description of how life appears, reasoning backwards, is illogical. Yet the consensus is that this is all we have as a paradigm. This is the prevailing attitude. It's very difficult to get anyone to think differently until you provide them with the evidence, and then they're okay with it. They're not happy with it, but they'll give it a pass. So I'll demonstrate that there is an alternative way of thinking about origins and mechanisms that mediate evolution that allows for the causal relationships that are testable and refutable. So the hallmarks of true science, what Popper described. Sorry. How are we doing for time? So the poets know what I'm talking about. So Frost said that life is that which can mix oil and water. He was right. That's what I'm talking about. So I'm going to relate 5 narratives that illustrate how and why complex physiology has evolved from unicellular organisms. The first narrative is about oxygen in the atmosphere, how it gave rise to the cholesterol molecule. The second is how gravity fostered complex physiology. The third is how physiologic stress gave rise to warm-blooded organisms. Birds and mammals are the only warm-blooded organisms. The fourth narrative is from unicellular organisms to Gaia, or Earth as organic. And the fifth is how being warm-blooded drove physiologic consciousness. So if you bear with me, and bear in mind that the 5 narratives give rise to sequentially to the next, each to the next, because evolution is a series of interlinked molecular pre-adaptations, or exaptations, which is what Gould and Verba called it, beginning with Stephen Jay Gould, beginning with the unicellular state as the author of life. So an exaptation that's a noun, and it is a feature having a function for which it was not originally adapted or selected. So, and Jacob, the Nobel laureate, called what Jacob called tinkering in a paper in 1977 in Science, which was, again, very cute and very interesting, but really didn't provide the wherewithal to test that idea. How do you test tinkering? So narrative 1 is about oxygen and cholesterol, how these micelles I described, in the evolution of chemiosmosis, the Mitchell hypothesis that endomembranes actually can separate ions, positive and negative on either side. So just like your car battery, they generate energy. And that in turn allowed for this negative internal free energy, or entropy, which is the driver for life, if you will. So that's the cell at its base, and then the homeostatic principle allows for the balancing of the free energy within the cell, which is critical, not only for the immediate condition of the cell, like the thermostat on the wall in your home, regulating temperature, but also being the mediator of evolution, if you will. So the cholesterol molecule, when it evolved back some 500 million years ago, because as Conrad Bloch, who discovered the cholesterol synthetic pathway, argued that, or reasoned that it takes 11 atoms of oxygen to make one molecule of cholesterol, so there had to be enough oxygen in the environment to do so. But as I said earlier, the cholesterol actually makes the cell membrane more conducive to the internal environment embracing the external environment through endosymbiosis. So what it did, so cholesterol facilitated metabolism, locomotion, and gas exchange. And those are the basic building blocks, if you will, of vertebrate evolution. So it's now known that over the last 500 million years, now Robert Berner has shown that rather than oxygen in the environment going from 0 to 21% oxygen, which is the ambient oxygen concentration in the atmosphere, it actually rose and fell fairly dramatically, going between 15 and 35%. People have focused on the upside of all of this because it's kind of cute to think about all these giant organisms like dinosaurs and giant dragonflies, but nobody seems to pay any attention to the hypoxic state. And we know that hypoxia is the most potent physiologic agonist known, at least for vertebrates. So I found that interesting, and I started to think about that. And here I'm showing the cholesterol pathway leading to progressively more complicated organisms, starting with, so bacteria don't possess cholesterol at all. Eukaryotes, starting with yeast, for example, do possess cholesterol in the cell membrane. The cholesterol forms what are called lipid rafts. Those lipid rafts actually are the basis for the receptors that mediate those growth factors I described earlier. And then ultimately you have all of this interesting interaction between cells mediated by the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is largely based upon cholesterol derivatives like steroid hormones and vitamin D. So the cholesterol is acting as this way to sort of bring everything together in complex physiology, and was the basis of the first book that we published back in 2012, using cholesterol as the way to think of the narrative of cellular molecular evolution. And in a series of experiments that were done back at the University of Maryland, I had discovered this phenomenon of neutral lipid trafficking, how it is that the lipids are taken up actively by these fibroblasts that have depicted the football-like shaped structures, but that the epithelial cells could not do that. So the interaction between those football-shaped cells and the square epithelial cells was actually what, first of all, protected the lung against oxygen because the lipids are antioxidants, and later on became the basis for the surfactant synthetic pathway. So that was an important breakthrough because it led itself to that diachronic approach to thinking about how these mediators evolved over space and time. Yeah, and I'm back to my diagram and my explanation of how this process of lipid trafficking, which I've just described experimentally, actually gave rise to understanding of the complexity of this space between the airspace and the vasculature that had really never been addressed before. People just assumed stuff, the vasculature gets taken up, metabolized, yada, 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 not thinking that there actually was an active series of processes that explain vertebrate gas exchange all the way back to the unicellular state. And so the second area is on the role of gravity and its effect on parathyroid hormone-related protein. I mentioned that earlier, so PTHRP is an important pleiotropic mechanism that is essential for the formation of alveoli, or they won't form, and the kidney, the glomerulus, is also dependent upon PTHRP for micturition, and it goes on, and the skeleton and the brain. So I'm going to explain that. So I had the good fortune to obtain bones from rats that have been flown in space. I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah. So the reason that astronauts, for example, wear spacesuits, pressure suits, is largely because the gradient that the lung is dependent upon for gas exchange, going from the top to the bottom, is lost in microgravity, in 0G. So the pressure suit retains that quality, and the mediator of that gradient is this parathyroid hormone-related protein. And the other principle involved is the loss of calcium from bone. Astronauts are known to suffer from osteoporosis. Same mechanism in the bone retains calcium in the bone. And so when there's lack of tension, gravitational tension in the bone loses calcium. And as I said earlier, the swim bladder of the fish shown there is the homolog of the line, both molecularly and physiologically, actually, in that in both cases they utilize gas, in the case of the swim bladder for flotation, or to rise to the top, or go to the bottom to feed or to sleep, for example. And in the lung, that principle is what maintains the patency, the alveoli from collapsing. And interestingly, when fish in large swimming pools, so zebrafish are allowed to hatch, they actually are known to take about 5 days to come up to the surface and take a bite of air. And that process actually is the homolog of the surfactant system. They take a first breath the same way that a newborn does in the delivery room. So we know that in this progression, the surfactant system matures in order for the animal to take that first breath. And here's evidence that, in fact, if you put a zebrafish into microgravity, they cannot surface. They're limited in their ability to generate buoyancy because of the lack of the integration of the swim bladder. So the gravitational effect affects the whole organism. So I'm showing the control animals. The black dots and the white dots are the level to which the animal can rise in the tank, if you will, under 0 G versus 1 unit gravity conditions. And molecularly, this PTHRP gene is amongst the top 50 genes expressed during the development of the swim bladder. And as I was saying earlier, I had the good fortune to obtain bones from rats that have been flown in space by NASA. And here, too, you see that the PTHRP messenger RNA, which is what determines the amount of PTHRP produced in these bones, actually is decreased in the littermates of these rats that were flown in space. The tibia, the femur, and the femur, the major leg bones, but the parietal bone, the skull, is unaffected. So it demonstrates that it's under tension that you, or lack thereof, that you have this loss of the PTHRP signal. And we've shown experimentally that if you put these epithelial cells from lung on a stretchable matrix, that within a very short period of time you get this dramatic increase in the amount of messenger RNA for PTHRP. So there was a direct effect of stretching, if you will, on the lung epithelial cells. And this is the device that we use to actually test the hypothesis that stretching actually is critical for PTHRP mRNA. Putting the cells into this NASA-approved device, it looks like a washing machine, basically. But what happens is you put the cells on these Cephadex beads that have a certain buoyancy, and so the cells will be in free fall as this device rotates. And so you're putting the cells into microgravity, and what you see is within about 12 hours, there's a dramatic decrease in PTHRP messenger. It reaches a new set point. And then if you put the cells back into unit gravity to demonstrate the cells aren't dead, they regain the ability to express this RNA. If you delete the gene from a mouse, a developing mouse, the lungs won't form alveoli. So on the left is newborn mouse lung with these air spaces, and you see that on the right, without the PTHRP, they have no air spaces. They die at the time of birth. So the PTHRP is critical for the formation of alveoli. So Neil Shubin had discovered the fossilized remains of the tetrapod representing the transition from water to land in 2006. And so there was experimental evidence for, fossilized evidence for tetrapods transitioning from water to land, which was important to me because I hypothesized again that the cells within the organism under physiologic stress they were being affected at the cellular level to explain the evolution of specific structures and functions that mediated the adaptation to land and the ability facilitate homeostasis. So PTHRP is a gravitosensor, it's a paracrine mediator, and it's also promotes the vascularization and the expansion of the microvasculature. So it's an important integrating mechanism. And again, I mentioned that the gene receptor, the receptor for the molecule duplicated in the water-to-land transition. So what may have transpired, although we don't know for sure, is that the lung, the kidney, the lung, the kidney, the limbs, because of the effect on bone, and the skin, which also is affected by PTHRP, that all of these structures, the signaling in the PTHRP in all of these structures was amplified because of the duplication of PTHRP, which would have facilitated that water-to-land transition. That's what the point of this exercise is. And as examples of this, for example, we know that the skin and the lung are homologous at the cellular and molecular level because they both exhibit the same characteristics with regard to the formation of these lipid inclusions shown here in the skin and in the lung. So in the lung, it's the surfactant. In the skin, the lipids form a barrier in the stratum corneum. But the same cellular and molecular properties are exhibited by both the skin and the lung. And in fact, the skin is the most primitive gas exchanger. So in frogs, they exchange oxygen through their skin and their lungs, for example. And also the skin and the brain. So the same principle is involved here. The lipids that are expressed in the skin as barrier function to prevent the loss of fluids from the organism, and also to prevent attack by microbial agents, because there are antimicrobial factors in those lipid structures. That same mechanism is what causes the myelinization of by the Schwann cell of axons. So there is, and the skin-brain hypothesis that Nick Holland had formulated a number of years ago explains the transition from invertebrates to vertebrates, because up until the time that the skin-brain hypothesis was suggested by Holland, there was no way to explain how the central nervous system evolved from worms, because they didn't seem to have one. Yet they did, because it was in their skin. And that's interesting from the clinical perspective, because all of the neurodegenerative diseases of the central nervous system have skin homologs. They have rashes that are consistent with this hypothesis. And in the kidney, you see similar homology between the lung and the kidney. On the left, the alveolus; on the right, the glomerulus, the structure that mediates water and electrolyte maturation by facilitating the flow of urine out of the glomerulus into the kidney. And in both cases, parathyroid hormone-related protein is the stretch-regulated mechanism that mediates those processes. So again, these ups and downs of oxygen were critically important in understanding the evolution of complex structures, as I'm showing here. The fat pad, the endocrine system, all of these properties of land-dwelling organisms were highly likely to have been given rise to through these transitions of oxygen, hyperoxia and hypoxia. As I said, hypoxia is the most potent physiologic agonist that we know of, in vertebrates at least. I don't know about other organisms, but other than bacteria, yes. Hypoxia is a major agonist. So it's not just, when we look at the phylogeny example of the lung going from the fish swim bladder to the mammalian lung in intermediate steps, or for that matter, the heart going from one chamber in an earthworm to 3 chambers in a bird to 4 chambers in a mammal. And similarly, you see this progression from the glomus of the kidney in fish to the glomerulus and the intermediate steps phylogenetically. All these properties of vertebrate phylogeny can be explained through these cellular mechanisms that I'm describing. So now we can understand why these properties evolved through specific growth factors signaling mechanisms. So it's a predictive model, cellular molecular mechanism, as a cellular molecular mechanism for natural selection, if you will. It generates testable mechanistic hypotheses for evolutionary theory, and it's a means of understanding the first principles of physiology, as I described earlier. So the central theory of biology, that all physiologic traits are adaptations of the unicellular cell membrane, is the basis for the second book that we published, Evolution, the Logic of Biology. So there actually is a logic, finally, that I can train, I can teach my neonatal clinicians that there actually is. You don't have to learn this stuff necessarily just by rote, but you can actually understand it rationally as well now. And so as I said earlier, so there are experiments where if you knock out the beta-adrenergic receptor, which is important for a heart function, it actually causes simplification of the rat or mouse heart from a 4-chambered heart to a 2-chambered heart, for example. So we know that these genes that were duplicated during the water-to-land transition were critical for the progression of the heart in this case. This is the experiment I described earlier that was done in Witt's lab, where they knocked out the cholesterol synthetic gene in the alveolar epithelial cells and discovered that, in fact, there was proliferation of these fat-containing fibroblasts, the lipofibroblasts I described earlier, and that was a compensatory mechanism based upon the evolution of the lung from its origins. So here's a direct example of how you see the recapitulation of the phylogenetic process when you lose a specific physiologic trait that facilitated that process in the first place. And the fourth narrative is the one on Gaia theory. This is Lovelock's idea that the Earth is organic. And if you combine that with what Christakis is saying about the networking, human networking in contagion theory, so if you start from the organism forming its own niche, so this is a popular idea in ecology, niche construction, and so the emerging concept of epigenetic marks in the environment being acquired directly by the organism in order to change its genetics, if you will, based upon its interaction with the ecology, and this is what my laboratory is funded for, to study childhood asthma. You see that, in fact, you can create novel niches which ultimately will form in the aggregate the ecosystem. And if you expand that all the way to the surface of the globe, you see that Gaia theory is not just a romanticized idea of Mother Earth. It actually has a potential testable basis in this idea of niche construction that came out about 10 years ago, and it has gained a lot of traction. I will gloss over that, and again, I'm talking about Tiktaalik here, and the idea that physiologic stress actually gave rise to these complex physiologic properties in order to adapt to land. Just so if you're wondering how that happens, physiologic stress increases blood pressure, increases shear stress on microvessels of those organs that are most afflicted. They generate radical oxygen species which cause the remodeling of structures and functions. That's well known in wound healing, and now I'm suggesting it's occurring in evolution as well. So the fifth narrative is the origins and rise of consciousness. So the model of vertebrate physiologic evolution is predictive, and again, I'm suggesting that when in the aggregate you have all of these tissues and organs being accommodated through their adaptive strategy due to physiologic stress, that in the aggregate, all of that, the visceral organs and the nervous system in the aggregate represents what we think of as consciousness. So lung evolution was gradual, occurring in a stepwise fashion in tandem with the skeletal evolution in adaptation to land. So we know that there were 5 separate occasions upon which vertebrates attempted to breach land, and such a saltatory process would have resulted in intermittent stages of hypoxia. And so quickly I'm going to explain that those intermittent phases of hypoxia, as the lung evolved in order to adapt to land, had profound effects on the central nervous system and on the adrenal gland. generating catecholamines, adrenaline. And what happened, or at least what I hypothesized, was that the adrenaline that's produced by the adrenal cortex alleviated the stress on the lung because epinephrine causes secretion of surfactant. So you had a stopgap measure for the gas exchange in the lung, but it had a tandem effect on the fat pad, on fat cells within the organism, because it caused the release of free fatty acids, which are very potent substrate for increased metabolism and body heat. So this is where the endothermy came from. And there are, in fact, physiologic evidence that the increase in body temperature was matched by specific changes in the lung surfactant that account for the properties of both within phylogenetically and developmentally. And I also wanted to mention that there's the appearance of the PTHRP mechanism in both the pituitary and also in the adrenal cortex. And those phenomena are usually considered to be happenstance, random events. They're not. They probably came from this selection pressure during the water-to-land transition, giving rise to the complex lung of mammals and birds, and also to being warm-blooded. So this stepwise process by which the organism interacted with an ever-changing environment is why the endocrine and respiratory systems are functionally interrelated evolutionarily, why cortisol accelerates lung development, as I showed earlier. These relationships are untenable by conventional descriptive biology and evolution theory, the former being dogmatic, the latter being predicated on random mutations. Clearly, the genetic changes depicted in the schematic that I just showed were determined by the cellular environment, referring all the way back to the introduction of cholesterol in the protocell membrane, facilitating metabolism, respiration, and locomotion. So I think you get the idea, and I'm talking here about opposable thumbs and being self-conscious being characteristic of consciousness. So both mammals and birds are warm-blooded, and both humans and birds are bipedal. And humans have opposable thumbs, but birds do not. Other primates have opposable thumbs, but are not bipedal. So the opposable thumbs are unique to man. And there is a study that was published in 2008 showing that, in fact, there's a specific genetic modification of the gene the gene that determines the opposable thumb, the wrist, and the ankle that probably facilitated not only bipedalism but also the opposable thumb in humans, because it's unique to man. So again, this idea that what we normally think of as these associations through phylogeny of these complex organs may in fact not be just happenstance, but may have been the consequence of the interaction of the organism with its environment. And just briefly, I'm showing here again this vertical integration of these processes, starting with the unicellular state, culminating in brain, mediated by homeostasis and allostasis, explaining this cascading effect of how the organism is interacting with its environment to generate evolutionary change. Okay. So these are the books that I've published so far. The first one is this one, Evolutionary Biology, Cell-Cell Communication, and Complex Disease. The second was the Evolutionary Logic of Biology, and the one that's about to come out soon is this book on evidence-based evolutionary medicine. So, I mean, if you have further interest, what I talked about is all in these books. And I had the audacity to suggest this is a beginning and not an end. And I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we've got about 25 minutes for Q&A and conversation. And I think I'll just let you field that yourself.
Sure. If there are questions. I would say, scientist falls in the forest. Here. Yes.
Just a couple of things. In your lecture content, you dealt with physics, chemistry, biology, and even medical science, etc. So naturally, I came up with this question in my mind in order to clarify, further clarify your area of expertise. So if you are nominated as a Nobel Prize candidate, what category would be?
when he talked about that guy who was talking about economics. I have no memory. It's an interesting question.
I'm the one who usually asks down to earth and then practical questions.
Yeah, because this, I've been accused of talking about the theory of everything, which is what I'm really talking about.
Yeah, so that's why I had this question.
But I do think that medicine would be, and physiology would be the most impacted. I think physics would also, because there are gaps in our understanding of physics. And I think that that's because there's a human signature in the way we think about physics. And my premise is that if you can mathematically express what I've been talking about, which I've burned through 2 mathematicians so far, then you could eliminate what's called the signature, the noise, human narcissistic thinking from the physics to understand string theory, for example. I think that it suffers from a certain bias, just like instrumentation does. But I guess the most practical, so since the Nobel is given for practical solutions, that, medicine, understanding physiology mechanistically in a way that is predictive. And we use it in my laboratory, and others know a pharmaceutical company that has told me that they use these principles to manufacture drugs successfully. So it works. And I do think that, all of the hype about personalized medicine, it's still associations and correlations. It will get closer to the voxel of the prediction, but it will never be predictive until we turn the whole concept around and start to understand it from its origins, just like we do chemistry and physics instead of alchemy and astrology.
Yeah, one more. If a pharmaceutical company hires you, how would you contribute to raise their stock price?
Well, I mean, I've been criticized by I started doing this stuff back in the 60s when we were trained to try and understand the etiology of disease. My peers have said to me, you really think that you can cure disease? I say, yeah, of course you can, but they've given up because they're just trying to make symptoms go away, because that's more lucrative than actually trying to devise some therapy that actually will address the underlying cause. So I would maintain, if in a pharmaceutical setting, you could actually. We've done it. We've discovered the cause of nicotine or cigarette smoke induced childhood asthma, for example, which is well documented, but it never was looked at the way we've been looking at it from an epigenetic perspective. How nicotine in the environment causes the hyperreactivity of the upper airway.
How about treating a generic disease, perhaps?
Such as?
Generic disease, there could be so many.
Sure, they all have, I maintain that they're all due to some polymorphic feature that causes a little wiggle in some intermediate step, causes inflammation, chronic inflammation, and that, if unaddressed, causes breakdown of the homeostatic state, and therefore what we recognize as disease. So if you could identify the intermediate step from a developmental and phylogenetic perspective, you could effectively develop a therapy that would work. Yeah, I maintain that. So we've done it with the surfactant. Right.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
I know a physicist who works at the SETI Institute, and he has worked with physicists a lot, and he says that the physicists are reluctant metaphysicians. Have you ever heard that? So the beginning is going up higher and higher, I think, to obtain the reality of being.
There's that classic statue of a chimpanzee on a stack of books, and at the bottom is Darwin's Origins, and it's contemplating a human skull. So this is the problem, is the fact that we co-evolved with a physical environment. Came along a little later, but basically we emanated from the same source. And so it's very difficult for us to extract ourselves from the process in order to understand it. And that's why I'm saying that we could theoretically do that in order to objectively consider the how and why of both the physical Big Bang and the biologic Big Bang independently of one another. Professor Cobb, you've thought a lot about this. No?
I wanted to ask, you were indicating that physics and chemistry are not really affected by the quantum phenomenon. Maybe I misunderstood, but it sounded like you were saying
No, they are.
that they were based on the atom,
They're based upon atomic theory, yes.
on atomic theory.
Yeah, yeah.
But isn't atomic theory, should I say, I think that in chemistry, there is more recognition that the atom is a relational phenomenon rather than, what I'm asking for is help in explaining.
Oh, no, I mean,
Isn't atomic theory, insofar as the atom is understood as a completely self-contained unit, isn't that itself breaking down in both physics and chemistry?
well, I know there's this
So the
argument.
quantum thing, eventually they have to understand the atom in terms of the quanta, don't they?
Well, actually, there's talk of having a meeting at this institution talking about the mereology of cause and effect in chemistry and physics, because there's a suggestion, I know through Eric Sherry, who's a chemistry professor at UCLA, who's told me that there's a lot of discussion about maybe doing away with chemistry because it's just an extrapolation of physics. I don't think that's correct. It's a different focus, but there is a lot of talk about that, and apparently it's going to be discussed here sometime in the near future. So if that, no, but both chemistry and physics comply with quantum mechanics, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't mean to distinguish, no, I was trying to think of, you know, it's easy to say, yeah, chemistry and physics are have first principles that are based upon a central theory. Well, to my recollection, that's atomic theory, whereas biology, there's no central theory. Other than, and people will, you know, recite the mantra of DNA, RNA, protein, but that's just a description of, you know, the process, not an understanding of why that occurred. And in fact, I maintain that DNA, the nucleotides came in after the lipids formed the cells, because the lipids have what's called a hysteretic property. So if you distort them, so as the oceans warm the lipids, they become mushy, and then, you know, when the sun goes down, they solidify. They have memory because they'll go back to the same shape that they started from. That's actually, I think, is where the origins of memory, which is very important. It's critical that you have memory in the system in order to achieve the evolutionary strategy. You have to remember where you came from to know where you're going. Yeah. So I think nucleotides actually came in after the fact. And that's often what you see is you have a sort of a process that addresses the problem at hand, but it's not ideal, and then over time it evolves into a constitutive process. And you see that it's almost ubiquitous.
So, if I understood correctly, in some sense you were offering a critique of Darwinian evolution for its sort of emphasis on randomness, and then, but then also tying in your maybe more causal evolutionary theory with quantum mechanics, which my understanding, and maybe I'm just wrong about that, is that the quantum emphasis definitely emphasizes the random, or spontaneity, or at least things that appear to be random and spontaneous. So I'm just curious on how
I see what
this,
you're saying.
you know what I mean? Like if
Yeah. No, I don't. I mean, I've always questioned Darwinian evolution because, you know, if you've got an animal, an organism that's hit by a cosmic ray and has some, you know, gene mutation, it's not going to do very well in, you know, the social networking because they're weird. You know, they're not going to get it on with another, you know, and in fact, most of these genetic mutations are lethal. So that doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, recognizing that the developmental and the phylogenetic processes do follow a pattern. It's called orthogenesis. And I've been criticized for suggesting that, but the reality is we're publishing a book on reverse evolution. So I collaborate with this French anthropologist who has this collection of what are called ammonites. So they're these invertebrates with these shells that he's shown that under stress, atmospheric or environmental stress, they demonstrate reverse evolution, for example. And I said that chronic diseases also are reverse evolution. So No, but yeah, I hear what you're saying with the quantum mechanics. No, I'm suggesting that there are homologies between quantum mechanics and biology, but that in reality, the biologic principle is one of the interaction between the environment and the organism.
Sure.
And that is both deterministic and probabilistic, as is physics. So yeah, I didn't mean to mislead.
No, that makes sense.
Just trying to sort of, how should I put it? I find it compelling in the sense that, there is a logic to progression that seems to hold up under scrutiny, at least from my perspective. Yeah, yes.
I just want to hear prediction and emergence and anthropic and panpsychism in the same
I know it's a mouthful.
breath. But as I heard it, anthropic principle is the paradigm now.
Pretty much.
Emergence, which some of us have learned to like, you say is untestable and it's weak from that perspective. Your prediction theory sounds good to me, but what? You're peer reviewed, but you're breaking out of the paradigm to talk this way?
Yes. Yeah, because most of what we understand in biology is dogmatic, is dogma. So for example, the life cycle, we just accept that as being the state of being, when in reality, the life cycle is regulated by the endocrine system, which we know is under epigenetic control. So Piaget's idea of on the breast, crawling, walking, toddling, is not because we have these big brains that have to be serviced. It's because you have to be in those different conditions in order to accumulate the epigenetic marks in the environment appropriate to the evolving environment. So it's totally the opposite of the way that it's explained now. And I think because of the reverse in the causation, you come up with the wrong answer, basically. And we know that's true. The classic example of ulcer, it's not stress, it's bacteria. But for I don't know how many decades we thought it was a stress-related phenomenon until, this guy in Australia swallowed some Heliobacter and caused ulcer in himself. Yeah, there are many examples.
So let's say you're right, and I hope you are. We're going to have to wait for the neo-Darwinian paradigm to expand or break or open up before your work is accepted. Is that right?
It's already broken.
Even though it's peer-reviewed?
The neo-Darwinian paradigm has already been broken. We expected the human genome to be at least 100,000 genes. Give me a break. A carrot has 40,000 genes, at least twice as small as a carrot, right?
But the new paradigm isn't established yet?
We're down to 19,000 last time I looked. But nobody questions that. Why is that so? Yeah, and even the aging process, it's understandable in the way that I've presented it because it's a bimodally distributed process. The communication principles are what create structure and function. The bioenergetics is limited. Hayflick has told us that. And the reason that the communication properties break down in what we understand as senescence and aging is because it's a natural progression. But that's not the way that the geriatricians and the aging, they're talking about telomeres and all this other hoo-ha. That's not correct, in my opinion. I think the telomeres are an epiphenomenon. Don't misunderstand. They are associated, but not causal. And we're spending close to $2 trillion a year in this country for healthcare, and we're getting poorer and poorer healthcare because we're exploiting a false model of health and disease. So that's another aspect of this. We still think of health as the absence of disease and vice versa. That's wrong. It's a continuum. And that's why I think what I'm talking about is important, because if you realize that there is a progression, you can develop diagnostic and treatment modalities that can address that. Whereas not what we're doing now is you have to become a patient, you have to have symptoms, and then you have to hurry up and try and do something to ameliorate those symptoms, signs and symptoms. It's very 18th century, 15th century. We're in the 21st century. So again, I don't mean to sound too hubristic here, but I've spent enough time in medicine to realize that for many reasons it's deteriorated because we're just not able to predict. Other than, infectious disease, blunt trauma, that sort of thing. Yeah, sure, you can predict there. But in terms of organic disease, no. Yes.
Could you talk some about how consciousness figures into this? It's not, I take
Not
it that you're
intuitive.
saying consciousness is not an epiphenomenon.
No. No, I think
Not
that consciousness is the aggregate of our physiology. So, the mind-body duality was a huge disservice. Yeah, I mean, in the sense that, it was probably better than the other theories at the time, but so it took 300 years before, Thoreau went to Walden to demonstrate that, he was integral with nature in order to disprove that dichotomy. But what I'm saying is that the unicellular organism is actually not only the origins of complex physiology, but we never actually left that state. We remain in that state. The zygote is what's dictating how the organism functions. It's the 180 degrees out of sync with the way that we think about our own life cycle and our reason for being. As the paper I published was the phenotype as agent. The phenotype is acting in a way that evolves in order to optimize the interface with the environment, to collect epigenetic marks to determine whether the organism remains at equipoise or changes. But that's all predicated on the organism's origins being the analog or the homolog of the singularity. It's all one of a kind.
So, from a theological standpoint, then consciousness was first.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. We're just a manifestation of that.
Manifestation.
And I don't know. I don't know what the singularity derives from. But I think that we're closer in the way that I think about it to understanding what's behind, on the dark side of the moon, what's on the dark side of the singularity, than we will be if we continue on this path. And maybe people don't want that. I don't know. I don't want to go there. Again, I'm not a metaphysician. But I do think that it's important to consider that possibility, that we actually could understand our own origins. Yeah.
When you first answered this question, you said consciousness is. Did you say that again?
Consciousness is the aggregate of our physiology.
Consciousness
So
is an aggregate of our physiology.
Yeah, so-
Very tweetable,
Yeah, so Helmut Perlmutter studies paramecia, and he's shown, if you put glucose in the water, the paramecium will gravitate towards the glucose, and in the process, calcium flux increases. Okay? So they're conscious of that glucose. And conversely, if you put yeast in microgravity, they lose their ability to polarize and to reproduce. So their cytoskeleton is actually dictating the status of the cell. And Hammerhoff and Roger Penrose has said that those cytoskeletal elements in the brain are what integrate brain function. I think he's right, but he omitted the visceral organs. The whole organism, all the cytoskeletal elements are all unified through allostatic and homeostatic principles. We're not body and mind. We're all of a piece, if you will. And that's why I say that is a manifestation of that consciousness. And again, I know it's, you start to drift into metaphysics, which I don't want to do, but I do like that idea because I think it provides a more holistic way of thinking about, a lot of aspects of our biology that are glossed over, if addressed at all. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to correct the number that you quoted. The healthcare, you mentioned that the $2 trillion, but it is a 17% of the GDP, which is about $3.5 trillion, which is 5 times of the defense budget.
And at one time in my life, American healthcare was maybe number 8 or number 10 in the world.
17%.
Now 35 in the world. And
3.5.
so infant mortality is rising, maternal mortality is rising. Why is that? Because we're putting, we've emphasized this bottom lineism, and we're just basically slapping, what we know scientifically as best we can in terms of evidence-based medicine on the problem, but we're really not addressing the underlying cause. And so we're creating a huge time bomb, actually.
Not only that, because the doctors are making too much money.
I agree. Absolutely right. No, the healthcare should never been held to a bottom line standard.
Yeah.
There are some institutions in society, like healthcare, like education, that never should have been, should not be held to that standard.
Earlier in the lecture, you mentioned something about cells in the eye having some correlative or something in the liver, was it? And maybe in other places as well.
Yes.
That reminded me of an article I read maybe about 20 years ago, written by an ophthalmologist, Korean by birth, but who was working in Massachusetts and had a fall on the airplane coming back from Korea. And one was Western colleagues suggested that he have acupuncture, and he laughed it off, saying, I came from Asia to study Western medicine and all that, but finally he did go. And then as an ophthalmologist, he decided to test some of the theories of acupuncture, and he shone light on the eye, and then took some lectures in the brain as to where there was some other connections. And interestingly enough, there were connections even in the feet, which is where three out of the 7 acupressure points for acupuncture were. Yeah. And so bottom line, his article was defending the right of patients to ask for acupuncture as a bona fide kind of medical intervention, and said that now he could try to put the two together. And it seems to me that some of what you're saying applies there, because if it's in the eye, it's in the liver, maybe also a couple of places in the feet and all that. And it also calls for better understanding of the medical practices of other peoples around the world, so that we don't just dismiss it because, and Norway, as far as I know, is the only country that seems to be paying attention to that kind of a model. They have medical schools where they have regular Western medicine, homeopathy, Asian medicine, and even some indigenous types of medicine as well. And I think that people have understood instinctively, or I don't know how, but they came to some of the same kinds of perceptions that now you can verify with modern science. Yes.
Absolutely. So there is an Office of Alternative Medicine at NIH, but they're not very well funded. I mean, it's sort of thing.
Right.
So there's somebody on my campus who does acupuncture research, for example, and he's had some funding. Made an interesting observation about that the meridian that runs along the spine.
Right.
It's actually populated by the bacteria in that meridian are different from those in the periphery. So, that's one aspect of this. The microbiome idea is very important and emerging, and so you can converge the acupuncture idea with the microbiome, for example. Yeah, so, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it does, what I'm talking about does open up to novel ideas. So we were funded to study, the Indian spice, curcumin, turmeric, because it's a very potent anti-inflammatory, and Indians have less inflammatory disease. Probably because there's a lot of turmeric in their diet.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
You mentioned your teacher, Lynn Margolis. She took some heat from trying to describe the evolution of the prokaryote cell to the eukaryote cell, that there was cooperation there, not just competition. Is she still taking heat for that, or is that idea?
Well, no, she died about 5
I know she died, yeah, but her ideas.
In the literature.
Yeah.
Well, no, I know that was not a very popular idea, but interestingly, there are some homologies between bacteria and eukaryotes that I've discovered that probably are the nidus of why there was this evolution of an organism that the bacterium have a hard shell, and so they don't interface with the environment. They do just the opposite. Whereas in eukaryotes, it's an embracing of the environment.
Right.
Yeah. So there's and I have to wonder. I think Wells is telling us that our bacteria are really what are dictating the biosphere, not us. We're just their vehicle. So there's an interesting literature on what's called the necrobiome. So they've shown that the bacterial population in a burial site is unique to that individual that was buried there. So they're calling it the necrobiome, and they're using it for forensic purposes. But my thought was, well, if that necrobiome goes into the into the soil, into the aquifer, it's incorporated into plants and animals. Well, there are stranger things have happened in terms of the immortality idea that our microbiome actually lives long after we we don't. For example, yeah. So that's a little bit.
Well, I want to thank you for being here. You do a lot of metaphysics for a scientist.